Do you hear?
Yes.
Okay, so you can go ahead and get started.
Okay. Hi, my name is Ruth Burnett Dorsey. I was the last of the Burnetts born on the farm, and I am 87 years old. I will attempt to tell you stories of the farm according to my memories, record books, and stories told to me by my father and my brother Rabbit. We will start with the Moores, just to let you know that our family history didn't just start with the farm. We have quite a lot of history before the farm. The Moores, we'll start with Matilda Boston, born in 1811. She was the mother of Grandpa Barry Boston, who was born in Texas in 1843. He was married to M.A. Boston, who was born in Missouri. They were the parents of my grandmother, Fanny, who was a mulatto born in Kansas. Fanny married William Moore, and they had 9 living children, of which my mother, Maggie, was the oldest, having been born in 1892, followed by Annie, John, James, David, Jesse, Albert, Mary, and Henry. Mom always told us the story that she was born in a horse-drawn buggy out on the road somewhere in between Galena and Baxter Springs. She was so small that her baby bed was a dresser drawer. Kansas was a state, having become a state in 1861, but Oklahoma was not made a state until 1907. So we assumed that she could very well have been born in Indian Territory. Mom also told us that she only completed the 3rd grade of school because in the 1890s, the Indian attacks were still so bad that their parents were afraid for the small children to walk to school. Mom had many nieces and nephews. I don't know if I can name them all, but I will try. Starting with Sister Annie, who was married to Lafayette Jameson. They had 13 children: Cyrilla, Marie, Castella, Tiny, Hazel, Faith, Leroy, James, Floyd, Robert, Anna Lorraine, Harry, and Eddie. Next was Uncle Jess, who was married to Livonia, and they had 9 children. And I didn't list their names, I will. And Earl, who had 4 children: Earlene, Dolores, Warren, and Gloria. Next was John, who was married to Edith, and they had 5 children: Carlos, June, Donald, J.E., and Buddy. And J.E. is now Bishop J.E. Moore, and he's going to be one of our speakers at our church service on Sunday. Next was Frank, who was married to Rolene, and they had 1 child named Fanny. He was later married to Mildred and had no children. Next was Dave and Henry, who had no children, and Mary, who was married to Wayman Watson and had 6 children: Helen, Francis, Wayman, James, William, and Gary. Wayman Sr. was killed in an automobile accident, and Mary remarried again. She married Henry Roper and had 2 more children, Billy and Tommy. Grandpa William Moore had a brother, Abner, and a sister, Lenny, who was mother of Arma and grandmother of Bobby, Benny, and Billy Bradshaw, who grew up in Joplin, Missouri. He also had a sister, Georgia, mother of Cecil, Ed, and Cornelia Jameson, and the grandmother of Gail Jameson Mitchell, who is a member of this reunion committee. That does it for the Moores. So now the Burnetts. Grandma Sidney Howard, an old slave woman, was born around 1845. The census shows that she had several children, but 1 child, Irene, was the child of the white slave master. He brought the slave woman Sidney and her small baby out of Tennessee to Baxter Springs, Kansas, just beyond the southern border, and bought her a home and set her up in a restaurant business, and then he went on back to Tennessee. Her restaurant was located where the Baxter Springs post office is today. That small child grew up and married my grandfather, James Burnett, who purchased the Burnett farm in 1883. Grandfather James Burnett had been a slave in Tennessee, And after the Civil War, he came to Kansas in 1881 with his father, Bolin, his mother, Jude, his brother, George, and sister, Elizabeth. They settled in Baxter Springs, Kansas, because it was just over the boundary of slave territory, 3 miles from Oklahoma state line and about 5 miles from the Missouri state line in what we call the tri-state area of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. Actually, as I indicated, Oklahoma still had not been considered a state, but it was still Indian territory. Only those family members came to Kansas in 1881. But James had other brothers and sisters who did not come. They were Anna, Franklin, Green, Hans, Thomas, and West. James's father, Bolin, was born a free man. His mother was Swedish, and we assume that his father was black. He was born in Virginia, but since he was a black child, his mother fled with him to Canada. It is not known when he returned to the South, but he returned to Virginia and married Jude. He was never a slave, and Jude, his wife, was never a slave, but their children were made slaves. He came to Virginia already with a trade. He was a wagon maker. As was mentioned, Bolin was never a slave, but his children became slaves. I do not know the slave names of his brothers and sisters, but grandfather James was sold to a slave master by the name of Master Nix. His discharge from the Civil War in 1863 shows his name as James Nix. We do not know how or when the family of Bolin and Jude got together, or if they ever did all get together after the children were sold into slavery. My brother Rabbit recalls hearing Grandpa James talk very fondly of Master Nix, so it was assumed that he was a very fair and decent slave master. We have not found exact dates of when Grandpa James took back the name of Burnett, but we do have documents using both names, James Nix, alias James Burnett, and James Burnett, alias James Nix. He was still James Nix when he came to Kansas. The name change to Burnett was after that. There was that old story about slaves getting 40 acres and a mule. That was not so. They brought their own mules with them, and they bought 160 acres from a mining company, which equaled 40 acres for each of the 4 families that came. 3 years after moving here is when grandfather bought the farm. He bought it from the railroad because it had a house and a barn on it, and he wanted to settle down and raise a family and start farming. He paid 240 acres. He paid $240 for the 40 acres. His brother George and his wife Laura Meyer bought land in Keelville, Kansas, which is between Baxter Springs and Melrose. To the best of our knowledge, they had 3 sons and 4 daughters. The sons were Frank, who we called Doc, who had 9 children: Albert, Hazel, Helen, Juanita, Lydia, Thelma, Gladys, Grace, and Frank Jr. William, who had 6 children: Donald, Paul, Orrin, Louise, Josephine, and Melvin, and George, who helped raise his brother William's children, Don and Paul, because William and his wife both died when the children were young. Other members of the family helped raise the other children, and the 4 daughters of George and Laura were Fanny, Sarah, Maud, and Blanche. James's father, Bolin, bought land just north of the farm and east of the railroad, and his sister Elizabeth moved into the little town of Baxter Springs and married of Mr. Owens, and they had 3 children, Ruby, Bertie, and Nona, and she raised the daughter of her brother Frank, Missy Cynthia. George eventually moved to Baxter and Bolin moved to Joplin, but Grandpa James kept his 40-acre farm, which we still call home. According to the 1885 census, Grandpa James and Irene had 2 sons, Charlie and Rufus. Then John, our father, and his twin sister Bessie were born in 1888. Grandpa James died in the spring of 1932 at the age of 91, In 1924, before he died, he split up the property by giving Charlie and John his 40-acre farm and giving Bessie Grandma Howard's place in town and a check for $175. Charlie was not interested in the farm since he was not living there, so he sold his part of it to John for a hog, a gun, and a little cash. John continued to live on the farm, and Charlie lived in Columbus, Kansas, and eventually moved to Parsons, Kansas. Charlie and his wife, Jessie Estes Burnett, raised 4 children: Maria, Marguerite, Geneva, and Mary. Sister Bessie married Fred Estes, and they had 3 children: Teresa, Dorothy, and Clarence. Bessie died early in their marriage, and Fred married Bertie, who helped him raise the 3 children. John married Maggie Moore, and they had 12 children, 2 of which were stillborn. The children were Irene, Henry, William, we called Bill, James, Orville, who was called Rabbit, David, Corinne, George, Fanny, and Ruth. Because they lost 2 in the middle, we were always referred to as the first 5 and the last 5. John and all of his children were born in that original farmhouse, except for Ruth. John bought a house and moved it to the farm in 1932, and Ruth was born in that house in 1935. That house, which still sits on the farm today, was purchased in town and moved to the farm by John's team of horses 89 years ago. There weren't many fences back then, and it was not unusual for people to cut through a corner of our farm going from Baxter to Columbus instead of taking the roads. We have a picture of the path they traveled across the farm and the water hole that they used to stop and water their horses. Speaking of Baxter and Columbus, they are 2 towns that are about 12 miles apart. Stories had it that Baxter was the county seat until one night thieves broke into the county offices and stole all of the county papers and moved them to Columbus, making Columbus the county seat. And it's still the county seat of Cherokee County, Kansas today. I'm sure they took those papers right across our farmland to get them to Columbus. John, our father, owned and operated the farm with the help of his boys through the Depression years and World War I. During World War II, 4 of the boys were drafted: Orville, Bill, James, and David. They allowed 1 boy to stay on the farm to help, so George was never drafted. And Henry had a family of 3 children to raise: Karen, Margaret Elaine, and Henry, so he was never drafted. Daddy and George did not do much farming. He and George worked on a big farm near us, and Henry worked on a big farm where he lived. When World War II was over and my brothers came home, David and Rabbit took over helping Dad with the farm. David didn't last long on the farm. He moved to Maryland, so that left Daddy and Rabbit to do the farming. George had married and moved to Chautauqua, but he and Henry came to the farm often to help Rabbit and Dad when needed. In fact, Henry had a garden on the farm, so he was there almost every day. His regular job was at the Yellow Transit Trucking Company, but in the evenings, he was at the farm. He was there so much so that his nickname became Country, because he was always headed to the country. After Dad died in 1958, Jim moved to the farm to help Rabbit, and because Dad had died without a will, all of the brothers and sisters went to court and signed our part of the farm over to Rabbit. Rabbit went to GI school and studied agriculture and increased the farm. He bought farm equipment, stopped farming with the horses, which Daddy was doing, and increased the size of the farm from 40 acres to about 500 acres. Oh, by the way, why do we call him Rabbit? When he was a little boy, Daddy used to go hunting a lot, and he'd bring home rabbits for Mom to cook. One day after a big rabbit dinner, they had company, and the lady said, "Oh, what a sweet little boy, and look at that cute little round tummy. What's in there?" And he said, "Rabbit." And he's been called Rabbit ever since. Only Mom called him Orville. On his 60th birthday, We got him a large birthday card and just put it in the mail to him and addressed it to Rabbit. On his birthday, the card arrived right on time. Even the mail carrier knew who Rabbit was. When Mom Maggie died, we were looking through old papers, letters, and photographs and found the old deed to the land dated 98 years previous and discovered that in a few more years, the farm would be 100 years old. And we decided that we should have a 100-year celebration and reunion. Thus became our first Burnett Moore family reunion in 1983. After Mom died, it was just Jim and Rabbit on the farm doing the farm work. Then Roscoe Bassett, Sister Fanny's son, started helping Rabbit with the farming. He had stopped dairy farming and just had the hogs. Then one year there was a bad hog disease and he had to get rid of all of his hogs. He never went back to hog farming again. After that, he just did basically wheat, corn, soybeans, and hay farming. After Jim died, it was just Rabbit and his nephew Roscoe Bassett farming. Roscoe had a full-time job, so he could not spend a lot of time on the farm with Rabbit. Rabbit died at 90 years old. His plan was to leave the farm to his nephew Henry, but Henry was killed in an automobile accident, so it was left to his nephew Roscoe Bassett, Sister Fanny's son. Although he is still in the Burnett family, Roscoe is the first person to own the farm whose last name was not Burnett in 128 years. Perhaps during the same time that John Wesley's family was having the first Burnett reunion in Baxter Springs, Mary Burnett Ferguson in Detroit, Michigan, was talking about having a Burnett family reunion. What the Burnetts in Baxter Springs did not know was that there were lots of Burnetts missing from the first family reunion. Where were they, and would we ever find them? We had included parts of the links, but the chain still had several missing links. We had included Wilburn Burnett and his family, but we did not know any others of Uncle Thomas's family. Wilburn's father was Uncle Thomas's son. We later found that Uncle Thomas had 3 children, Robert, Charles, and Fred. Wilburn was the son of Frank. We had included members of Elizabeth's family also, and we had included members of George's family. We had heard that 2 brothers had settled in Texas, but we could not find anyone who knew anything about them. One missing link was the family of Grandpa James Burnett's, James's brother, Franklin Burnett, and his wife, Adelaide Hill. They had 3 children, Wilsie, Missy Cynthia, and Luther. Their mother died during childbirth with Missy Cynthia. Aunt Elizabeth, called Aunt Melissa by some and Aunt Liz by others, brought Missy Cynthia to Kansas with her and the original Burnett settlers when she was still a baby and raised her until she married. Missy Cynthia's brothers, Wilsie and Luther, were left in Tennessee in the Mount Orange community. With farmers having little or no money to travel, they never saw one another until some 40 years later. They were too young to remember names and faces, and little communication was carried on between the brothers and sister. Missy Cynthia Burnett married a Mr. Bryant, and they had 3 girls and 1 boy, Valerie Bryant Shepherd, Zephyr and Eileen Bryant, and Jewel Bryant. And Elizabeth was married to Burl Owens, and besides raising Missy Cynthia, they had 3 children of their own, Nona Owens Duval, who had no children, Bernie Owens Montgomery, who had no children, and Ruby Owens Estes, who had 1 child, Kathleen. The first record of ownership of land in Tennessee was for Wilsie and Lizzie Wilson, dated June 13th, 1900, in Gibson County, Tennessee. Wilsie was known as Pap Wilsie to some grandchildren and as Grandpa Wilson to others. Lizzie was called Mother Burnett by her grandchildren and Miss Sepp by others who knew her. Wiltsey was born in 1879 and Lizzie in 1877. They had 3 children: Missy, born in 1895, Willie, born in 1897, and Johnny, born in 1899. They later had 6 more children: Wilson, Addie, Preston, Marshall, Thomas, and Isaiah. Most of the family members were listed as mulatto. Only 2 of them were listed as black. After continuous prodding from Mary Ferguson, they began to plan their family reunion for the Burnett-Wilson family in 1985, thinking that they were having the first Burnett family reunion. Some way or another, the Kansas Burnetts got wind of the Burnett reunion being planned in St. Louis and got ourselves invited. Thus, in 1985, we joined more of the Links. We have since had reunions, including more family, and the family just keeps getting bigger and bigger as we meet more and more kinfolks. That's it.